When compared to many of the other vehicles, you could even say most of the other vehicles that we've talked about in this series, be it crazy race cars, weird concepts, or just obscure test vehicles like the Citroen PLR or the ZIL E167, this could appear to be a fairly generic car, you might think, within the sports car or supercar world, and chances are, in a similar way to something like the ProDrive P2, that some of you guys are already aware of this vehicle, the Invicta S1. It's one of those supercar brands, one of those supercar models that kind of popped up in the mid to late 2000s and then just kind of faded away again, and that's a shame when that happens. The Ascari KZ1, the Marcos TSO GT2, these really great little supercars, or super sports cars in some cases, that kind of just get forgotten. The MG SVR as well. Great examples of, at least as far as the ones I just mentioned, these British, in particular, exotic marques and models which, as I said, they get forgotten, they get obscure, they sometimes pop up for sale and you don't really know what it is unless you've heard of the car before. That could definitely happen with this one. Now, I'm not exactly sure how many Invicta S1s were actually built, but it was planned to have a production run of 20 cars per year. So pretty exclusive. In fact, it makes a Marcos or a TVR look fairly mainstream. And what you're probably wondering, of course, is why should you buy one? What does the car bring to the table? Because the whole point of these exotics is to have your own take, your own gimmick, if you will, to some degree. That's kind of like what companies like Koenigsegg does with their crazy doors, or what they did when they were first bursting onto the scene, or Spiker, for instance, with the aviation-inspired interior, the Mercedes SLR with the gull-wing doors, and the F1 nose cone. They're all kind of these little gimmicks, in effect, but they're ones which are good. They actually give the car character, they give it its own take, its own spin on the market. Now, in the case of the Invicta, it has a very interesting and actually a rather unique gimmick to its name, and one which I actually think is pretty cool. And that is, if you look at this car closely, you might have noticed something strange about the body, because excluding the bonnet, the trunk, and the doors, there are no seams. This car doesn't have bumpers, and it doesn't have sills. The entire body is one piece of carbon. Now, I think that's a pretty cool gimmick. It's not exactly a practical one, because it means if you crash, you've got to replace the entire body. But let's face it, the people who can slap down six figures on a car like this probably don't really care too much about that. But I think that as far as gimmicks go, that's actually kind of a cool one. Now, speaking of that six-figure price, this car starts at over 100 grand, and there are three different versions that you could buy, or at least you could until production ended in 2012, because the manufacturer who make this, a British marque called Invicta, are not new. In a similar way to Spiker or TVR or Marcos, they're one of those marques that kind of dunk in and out of the scene and go under again every so often due to financial trouble more often than not, and that has happened to Invicta 4 times so far, and they've been around since the mid-1920s, so they're not a new company at all. Just like Spiker. Spiker is actually one of the oldest companies of its type in the world, stretching way back into the 1800s, the mid-1800s if I recall correctly, producing stuff like horse-drawn carriages, but with, ironically, the same kind of design and attention to detail that their cars still have today, which I think is really cool. Now, in the case of Invicta, they don't really have that kind of success to their name. They've gone under and come back again a number of times, and that happened again in 2012 because they didn't sell enough cars and they had a 40 grand outstanding debt, which they failed to pay back. So it's kind of unfortunate for such a relatively small amount of money for a car company to go under because of that, but the car itself offers an interesting package, and I actually think it's a good rival for a couple of other exotics, including the Ascari KZ1, because just like that Ascari, this is one of those supercars that has a number of interesting things in kind of a general sense, but still didn't really stay in people's minds well enough. And unfortunately, it definitely didn't capture the buyers' attention enough to buy enough of them to keep the company afloat. Now, the car's powered by American power. It's an SVT Ford-powered vehicle, a 4.6-litre V8. As I said, there are three forms, the 320, the 420, and the 600, which, as you would assume, refers to the power. And in the case of the top of the range, which we'll focus on in the video, that car, the 600 with 600 horsepower, surprise, surprise, is a bored-out version, so it's a 5-litre V8, and the performance is actually pretty healthy. It's quoted to be capable of over 200 miles per hour, 0 to 60 in 3.8 seconds. Now, the only thing that I have trouble believing in the case of these models is the quoted weight, because Invicta claimed that it weighed 1,100 kilos, which is 2,400 pounds. That seems very ambitious for a car that does have a leather interior, a number of other things, and it doesn't exactly look like a lightweight car. It's pretty big, especially by British standards. So I'm not so sure if I'd put any money down on that. I might put money down on it being heavier. It looks more like a 12 or 1,300 kilo car, to be honest. But sure, if it does weigh 1,100, all the power to them. Now, as far as pricing goes, it varies from 100 grand for the base model up to 160 grand for the 600. But in the world of supercars, that actually still sounds pretty good. Especially, of course, when you bear in mind that the Ascari was a £235,000 car, which was definitely far too much. So in comparison, this actually doesn't sound too bad. Now, as far as production went, as I said, it ended in 2012, which was unfortunate, and one of the reasons why I think it is so unfortunate is because this car actually is better than many people give it credit for. Because this car has a number of race spec parts, which you probably wouldn't expect it to have. It's got fully adjustable race suspension, a race diff, Brembo brakes with racing discs. It's available with an automatic, or at least the lower models are, for like an extra 8 grand on top, which is a bit weird, but there you go for those who wanted that. And the performance, if it lived up to the quotes, which seems fairly probable that it could with 600 horsepower, then it would have been a perfectly acceptable entry into the supercar scene. But I think therein lies the problem. It was perfectly acceptable. It wasn't remarkable. And that is one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, why it reminds me of the Ascari KZ1. It failed. The Ascari KZ1 is not a car which has remained in the public consciousness and has the same love as other rivals of the time, the Carrera GTs, the SLRs, the Enzos, the MC12s, despite the fact that it's actually got a similar level of performance. So I think that what Invicta maybe could or should have done, had their financial troubles not overtaken them, is taken a similar approach to what Ascari did. Ascari made the KZ1, which was a great supercar but an undervalued one. Then they took it racing and they used that experience to turn it into one of the most brutal supercars of recent years. The legendary A10, the yellow with black stripe monster that of course was featured on Top Gear, brutally quick. It's up there with Moslas and Gumper Apollos. If Invicta had done that, maybe not taking it racing, but that certainly wouldn't have hurt the car, and made that hyper hardcore version of the S1, maybe still with 600 horsepower but more extreme bodywork, maybe a wing of some kind of memorable livery like the Ascari has, I think that could have really helped the brand. Unfortunately, that's not the way it panned out, and like so many other projects, it was a victim of a lack of funding. Or, more accurately, in the case of Invicta, 40 grand of unpaid debt. So, in the case of this car, it's kind of an unsung hero despite, ironically, being fairly well known within the supercar world. It's one which I think is quirky, it's weird, looks kind of like a Marcos TSO mated with an Aston Martin and then got left out in the sun for too long and half melted. But in a weird kind of way, I actually find the car kind of appealing looking, especially from the front end. But ultimately, it's another sad case of a failed car, and maybe Invicta will rise again in the future as TVR are, with some kind of other option, other project, perhaps. But that's it for this installment. Of course, if you want to check out other weird cars that we've discussed in the past, you can click through here at the end to see those. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.